judge acquitted him of that charge. But I think what Manning did was appalling. I think he betrayed his fellow members of the military. He betrayed the Foreign Service. And he should be going to prison, and he will be.
Glenn, I know you disagree.
I do. I think the verdict, and I also think that Jeff's comments kind of underscore what a lot of people really hate about Washington, which is that if you're sufficiently rich and powerful and well-connected in Washington, the laws don't apply to you. You don't get punished. The only people who do are people like Bradley Manning. The theory that the government used, one of which was not successful, but many of which were, was that he engaged in espionage and helped the enemy because the material that he caused to be published on the internet ended up being helpful to Osama bin Laden. Bob Woodward has written book after book after book and has become extremely rich by publishing secrets way more sensitive than anything Bradley Manning ever published. Nothing that Manning published was top secret, unlike what Bob Woodward publishes. And yet nobody would ever talk about Bob Woodward the way that Jeff Toobin just did, or his sources, because he's in good standing in Washington. His sources are high-level officials in the White House. They leak all the time. Washington is nothing about leaks. And yet the only people who get punished for it are people who are marginalized in Washington, and that's a broader reflection of how the law is abused.
Jeff, what about that? Because you do have people leaking all the time for political reasons.
You do have some leaking going on, and we could have a debate on a case-by-case basis, but Bradley Manning released 700,000 cables, including the life's work of a lot of Foreign Service officers who risked their lives, and the people they talk to risk their lives to talk to American officials. And the idea that Bradley Manning has the right and it was somehow justified in releasing this material, I think is just completely wrong. And Bob Woodward is a separate story and unrelated as far as I'm concerned.
Glenn, does a government, in your opinion, have any right to any form of secrecy? Secrecy in their diplomatic cables, secrecy in their, the foreign policy discussions that go on in embassies overseas? Because those are the things that were in a lot of the cables that Bradley Manning released.
The government has limited rights to secrecy, but it is so wildly abused. I mean, the argument that people made when these diplomatic cables were released was, well, there's nothing really significant or newsworthy or new in these cables. Well, then why were they all marked secret? The reason is because the government just reflexively marks everything secret. And the thing that I find most bizarre is that anybody who would go into the field of journalism or call themselves a journalist, who would call for the prosecution and imprisonment for decades of a source like Bradley Manning, who, as I said, didn't publish anything top secret the way that most sources for large media outlets in America do all the time, it's baffling. What Bradley Manning did is the job of journalists, which is to bring transparency to what the government is doing. And even the Pentagon admits that its early claims about how he has blood on his hands and there was all this damage was wildly overstated. He released very low-level secrets that informed the world about the U.S. government and harmed nobody.
But it's not up to Bradley Manning to make the decision to disclose this. I mean, these are people who, the people who wrote those cables have devoted their lives to trying to make the world a better place, particularly Foreign Service officers. Maybe you disagree about that, Glenn, but I admire the Foreign Service a great deal. And, I trust their judgment about what's a secret a lot more than I do Bradley Manning.
Right, and look, Jeff, you can make that argument in every leak case. I mean, people back in the 1960s said Daniel Ellsberg was a traitor. Who was Daniel Ellsberg to decide what should be leaked to the American public? I trust U.S. generals way more than some Daniel Ellsberg who I never voted for, and yet what Daniel Ellsberg did was expose systematic lies on the part of the U.S. government. In the Bush years, people said whoever told Dana Priest at the Washington Post that the Bush administration had secret CIA prisons, or whoever told the New York Times that the Bush administration was spying without warrants, what right did they have to disclose secrets? This is how journalism, investigative journalism works, Jeff, is that people inside the government with a conscience come forward when they find out things that their government is doing that are wrong, and they disclose it to the world through media outlets and journalism. If you think that's criminal, you're essentially calling for the end of investigative journalism. That is what investigative journalism is about.
No, I appreciate your education to me of what journalism is, but, releasing 700,000 cables in a completely blunderbuss way is not the same as the work of Dana Priest and Bob Woodward. I mean, I just think, it is possible to draw. Well, Daniel Ellsberg also wrote the Pentagon Papers. He disclosed what he wrote, which is very different than Bradley Manning disclosing hundreds of thousands of cables they didn't even read, much less write.
But Glenn,
You don't know that he didn't read them.
Jeff, Glenn makes an interesting point, and it is an accurate point, that when this was all revealed, you had politicians up and down saying he has blood on his hands. You had people in the Obama administration saying this is causing cataclysmic damage, long-term damage to national security. And then later on, in testimony, secret testimony that was revealed in Reuters and other news outlets, they basically all kind of said, you know what, it was embarrassing, but it really didn't really amount to much.
I have no doubt that the government officials here overstated the amount of danger. But that doesn't mean there was no danger. And that doesn't mean that we don't know fully what the danger was, including the risk to the fact that many people may not talk to government officials anymore as a result of these kind of disclosures.
Jeff, what legal precedent do you think this sets, if any, for Edward Snowden?
A big one. I mean, I think Snowden will be confirmed in his desire to stay out of the United States, because I think their situations are very parallel in terms of the amount of disclosure that went on. And I think he's likely to face exactly this kind of prosecution and exactly this kind of result and sentence.
And Jeff, what do you make the way that Bradley Manning was treated, the way he was held, the conditions under which he was held?
That, as far as I am aware, was an appalling it was too much done. It was inappropriately harsh conditions, but that doesn't justify the underlying behavior that led to the case either.
Glenn, you posted on Twitter today, quote, you said, "So weird how most people who claim I'd respect Snowden's acts if he hadn't fled don't apply that to Bradley Manning." Explain what you mean.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. So many people love to start off the sentence by saying, of course we need more transparency, and that they always somehow find a way to attack whistleblowers. So people say, oh, if Snowden hadn't fled, I would respect him, and yet Bradley Manning didn't flee, and yet most of the people attacking Snowden attack Bradley Manning. Or look what Jeff said earlier. Well, Manning is wrong because he didn't read all the documents that he leaked. I can assure you with 100% certainty that every single document that Edward Snowden turned over to us, he very carefully read before he gave them to us, because they're all in incredibly detailed file systems, and every single document is filed according to topic. So if what Jeff is saying is true, which is my problem with Bradley Manning, is that he didn't read all the documents, unlike Daniel Ellsberg, he should be praising Edward Snowden, and yet he isn't. He's been a harsh critic of Snowden. It seems like people always contrive excuses to attack anybody who brings transparency to the government, unless they're powerful officials in Washington, in which case it's okay.
I'm not talking about powerful officials. I'm talking about Foreign Service officers who are on the street in every capital in the world and small cities around the world, trying to gather information, report it to their superiors. The idea that Bradley Manning is the only one, or Edward Snowden is the only one who has a conscience and who is decent and has the right to disclose the work of all these people is just palpably absurd to me, Glenn.
Glenn Greenwald, good to have you on. Jeff Toobin as well. Thank you.